All right. Hello, everybody. Module 9 of 10. So we're almost to the end. And the idea for this week is to do a couple extra things to help us think about the movie Do the Right Thing. And I was just realizing and getting these notes ready for this little mini lecture that I hope you're getting to talk a lot about it in your class without me around and without the undergraduates. The Zoom sessions are just not enough time. So we'll go over some of this in the Zoom session, but I'm hoping you also find a way to use this in your own discussions in the classroom. It's pretty clear that Spike Lee, the director of Do the Right Thing, wanted us to think about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. He shows their photos at the end of the movie, and the plot seems designed to put the movie into conversation with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. I also hope you now have a different feel for what it might mean for me to call those two figures moral philosophers, which they very much were. They spent a lot of time thinking about moral philosophy, about how to change the world, about what's good. And they were students of moral philosophy. They read philosophical texts. They knew history. They were both religious in their own way. So they spent a lot of time thinking about these things, which is why I think it should be a meaty part of anybody's education. And so I hope the course makes you feel like you've been brought into conversation with them a little bit more. Okay, so let me go to my notes for this lecture. I assigned an article, which I only recently came across by Clay Carson. Clay Carson is a professor of history, now retired at Stanford University. He studied mostly Martin Luther King Jr. in a historical context, but also ran for many years the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project. So all of Martin Luther King Jr.'s papers, letters, writings, everything is in an archive at Stanford, which is pretty amazing. I got a chance to go over there a few times in my student career as an undergraduate and, well, as a graduate student, actually. And the article I found in wanting to bring this into the class, so I hadn't seen this before, by Professor Carson, who, by the way, also lectured in SLE when he was not retired. So I know him, and he's come to the SLE program many times. The article is called The Unfinished Business of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And that unfinished business you already might have a sense of what that means, because there's a kind of expectation that Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were, and I'll start to say Martin and Malcolm, were at odds in their philosophy, their approach to social change, and even what kind of change was required when it came to race in America. And so the article, I hope, but it's not very long. I hope when you look through it, you'll learn a lot about both figures if you didn't already know those things. Professor Carson does a good job of just painting their biography in brief. But he starts off the article with the two points of racial integration versus racial separation. So integration, Martin's view, and separation, Malcolm's view, and those being at odds with each other. And then Martin's call for nonviolence when it comes to social change versus Malcolm's strategy, which is kind of summed up in a phrase he used, any means necessary. So nonviolence versus any means necessary. But then he Professor Carson quickly asks in the article, is it really, were they really that at loggerheads? Is it maybe a little more complicated, or maybe even in ways complementary, that they just didn't get a chance to work out? So he works through their biographies and how their biographies shape their lives, and maybe explains a little bit the differences between them. He notes that Martin has a story that's been crafted for public too, that we know a lot about Martin Luther King Jr. from The Holiday and from learning about him in school, and that Malcolm is a little harder to get at, partly because we, for a while, only knew him mostly through his autobiography, but now a lot of scholarship is is being done. So there's some work that historians do to correct some of that. Both were advocates of theologies of liberation, meaning they aspired to liberate African Americans by way of religious thought. So through Christianity for Martin and through Nation of Islam, it's fairly complicated on Malcolm's side, but both theologies of liberation, religion and its role in securing freedom. They resolved, and kind of tragically, eventually to get together to discuss Martin's goal of forging what he called a common solution to a common problem. So getting together, Martin and Malcolm getting together to find a common solution to a common problem, to work out their differences, to show leadership together instead of divisively. Malcolm was assassinated shortly after, so that conversation never came to be. And Professor Carson ends his article, and I'm going to read like 3 paragraphs. I'm going to be reading for a little while, by kind of hinting at, well, not hinting at, but I guess maybe guessing at what could have been worked out between them. So this is the bottom of page 25 in the article you were assigned. Rather than recognizing the points of convergence in the ideas of Martin and Malcolm, most Black leaders of the era after King's death in 1968 saw them as irreconcilable alternatives. So, this is me interjecting, there's a whole period where they're seen as irreconcilable. Black people were advised to choose between Martin and Malcolm, rather than affirming that each offers a partial answer to the problem of race. Unlike many of their followers, the 2 men understood at the end of their lives that their basic messages were compatible rather than contradictory. Both saw that the building of strong Black-controlled institutions in African American communities did not contradict the goal of achieving equal rights within the American political system. Indeed, they came to understand that achieving one goal could contribute to the achievement of the other. Perhaps the most important consequence of their tragic deaths was that they were unavailable to serve as elder statesmen for the African American freedom struggles during the period of ideological uncertainty following the passage of historic civil rights legislation. Had they lived, Malcolm and Martin might have advised their followers that the differences between the two were not as significant as was their shared sense of dedication to the struggle for racial advancement. Malcolm came to realize that nonviolent tactics could be used militantly and were essential aspects of any mass struggle. Indeed, he himself was a peaceful man who never used violence to achieve his goals. Martin, for his part, remained philosophically committed to the ideals of Gandhian nonviolence, but he increasingly recognized that mass militancy, driven by positive racial consciousness, was essential for African American progress. "I am not sad that Black Americans are rebelling," Martin remarked in his last published essay. "Without this magnificent ferment among Negroes, the old evasions and procrastinations would have continued indefinitely." And then skipping a couple of paragraphs here to go to Professor Carson's last paragraph. Martin also understood the importance of racial pride, even if he took such pride for granted. He recognized that African Americans would never be free until they signed their own Emancipation Proclamation, quote, "with the pen and ink of assertive selfhood." But he also saw that the destiny of African Americans was inextricably linked to that of all people, and that any freedom struggle should have reconciliation as its ultimate goal. His message can enlighten us in these times when racial and ethnic conflicts have engulfed many nations and may yet engulf this one. He knew that nonviolent struggles seeking reconciliation and redemption do not offer the same excitement and emotional satisfaction as do revenge and retaliation. Yet he also understood that despite our differences, we are inextricably bound together in a network of interdependence on our increasingly endangered planet. So I hope this is helpful in thinking about the movie, and maybe I should have said a little bit more at the start of this mini lecture about the problem in the movie of the burning down of the pizza place, of that kind of violence set against the background, of course, of police violence, and thinking about what's right in creating social change. The idea of racial integration versus separation that's in the movie, the idea of racial pride that's in the movie, the Italian pride on the part of the pizza parlor owners, and African-American pride that becomes the matter of the protests. So there's plenty to talk about in the movie on its own when it comes to those things, and how people acted, and what you think of how it all played out. But hopefully this little connection to Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X is also informative in both directions, for the movie to help you think about those two historical figures, and for those two historical figures to help you think about the movie.